Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there is another update with several Russian advances across the Donetsk section of the front line, where the rest of the front line is seeing little to no movement. Instead, the Ukrainians have launched a new assault into the Kursk region from the western parts of it. The Ukrainians launched several assaults with armored vehicles trying to break through the Russian initial defensive line. What we are seeing in the Kursk region is that the Ukrainians are trying to re-enter in the western parts near Veseloe and Pokrovsk, where they have previously launched an assault into Russian territory. They are trying to take advantage of the bridges blown and the difficult supply situation for Russian forces operating south of the same river. They are also trying to gain control over Tetskino, which is a town that is connected to the Ukrainian side of the border within the town of Lysivka. The Russians are attempting to hold back the Ukrainian forces, so far focusing with artillery on the Ukrainian positions as they try to push through, as well as FPV drones. There's numerous footage of Ukrainian vehicles being attacked on their way to break through the Russian defensive lines, which mainly consist of the Dragon Teeth. So far, the Ukrainians are working on breaking through the Russian defensive line, but have been unable to capture any territory so far. So the fighting is taking place at the border area between the two countries. The Russians continue their offensive operations in the eastern section of the front line, where the Russians have managed to advance north of Toretsk to the intersection area towards the town of Novopoltavka. The Russians gained control of the remaining parts of Lysivka, fully secured Kotlyne, as well as a fortified position to the east of the town. The Russians also managed to advance north of Udashne along the river line. The Russians also managed to gain control over the town of Kotlyarivka, here to the west of the highway connecting Selidove, Pokrovsk, and Kurakhove. The Russians also advanced here to the south of Odradne as they expanded their positions along the fields and forest lines. The Russians also managed to advance to the south of Zelenopole, where we see that the Russians managed to gain control over several fortified positions, some forest lines and fields, reaching the outskirts of Novopil and advancing along the main road towards Zelenopole. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the border area between the Zaporizhia and the Donetsk region in the southwestern outskirts to put pressure on the Ukrainian positions along their defensive line. With this, the Russians have managed to gain control over several fortified positions in the area, the border area between Zaporizhia and Donetsk in the south near Rivnopil, securing Rivnopil and the positions of the Russian forces along the river line. By expanding the distance between the frontline positions and the towns, it will secure the towns further for operating as logistical hubs for the Russian forces, allowing them to concentrate more forces in the area and launch stronger operations and larger operations. With this, the Russians have managed to secure several forest lines, allowing them to send troops to the outskirts of Novopil, where the fighting will likely take place, as Russians will launch attacks from Novodarivka to the south and from the forest lines to the east. This will allow the Russians to gain control over all of the towns to the south of this road, and also allow them to start pushing towards Zelenopole from the south and from the east. With the recent advances north of Novosylka as well, the Russians can look to bypass the fortified positions and flank them from the rear, allowing them to attack Zelenopole from the north, east, and south, all at the same time. Also allow the Russians to secure further their supply route towards Vinnypole for offensive operations in that direction as well. Russians are generally launching offensive operations in between the defensive line here to the north and then along the border area to the south. The Russians are looking to gain control over all of the towns and fortified positions in this area to secure the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and to improve the logistical situation for Velika Novosylka and the surrounding villages. With the advance northwest of Rozdolne, the Russians have also secured additional fields and forest lines where they're looking to advance in the direction of Odradne and secure the town, which will allow them to cut off the supply line towards Behatir, encircling all of the Ukrainian forces in the area, except for a single crossing across the Vovchi River line, where Russians are fighting within the town of Behatir. The Russians are looking to gain control over the fortified positions and the towns here to the south of the river line and east of the river line here northwest of Novy Komar. The objective of the Russians is to threaten the towns and villages along the river line and highway connected to the town of Novopavlivka to the northwest. and also surrounding the towns and villages from the positions of the Ukrainians along the river line, the Mokrieli river line here near Komar. By cutting off both the highway to the west and gaining control over the towns will allow the Russians to leave only this singular highway, supplying the Ukrainian forces along the Vovcha river line. And with the advances and capture of Kotlyarivka, the Russians are looking to gain control over the highway there as well, cutting it off from its supplies, leaving the Ukrainian positions completely encircled. Therefore, the Russians are looking to expand west of Kotlyarivka, enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region, cut off the highway, launch an assault towards Toretsk, cut off that highway as well, which will encircle all of the Ukrainian positions from Behatir to the southeast to Dashne in the Dnipropetrovsk region, completely isolating them from any supply lines. With the Russian capture of Kotlyarivka, the Ukrainian positions are remaining with 3 villages remaining under Ukrainian control, and the Russians have the northern flank covered, allowing them for attacks towards Toretsk and Horihova from the north. Combined with assaults from the east, the Russians will be able to attack these villages from 3 separate directions, the north, east, and south, allowing them to gain control of them by threatening them from multiple directions. And with limited supply to their forces in this direction, the Russians will likely soon gain control of it and reach the Dnipropetrovsk border area, where they can start flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians to the south, and also move in to cut off the highway, which will leave the Ukrainians with low supplies and flanked from the weak point. At the same time, they will have the geographical advantages as well. This means that the Ukrainian positions here along the Vovcha river line and the highway are extremely vulnerable. To the north of Uspenivka, the Russians have managed to secure the first lines here northwest of Lysivka, to the south of the fortified positions, and gaining a foothold within the residential areas and the very eastern outskirts of Novosibirsk. The Russians will look to advance along the main road towards Novosibirsk and potentially cross the river, the Solona River, through Novoalexandrivka to enter Novosibirsk from the south as well, gaining a foothold and advancing towards the Dnipropetrovsk region from there as well. In general, the Russians are now very close to the Dnipropetrovsk border area, and there is only a few villages remaining under Ukrainian control. And with the general offensive of the Russian forces from the south of Pokrovsk all the way to the southwest, the Ukrainians are being threatened in all of these directions. The Russians also managed to secure the remaining parts of Kotlyarivka, where the Russians managed to gain control over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians by launching several FAB bombs. The Russians will continue to advance to the north of the town to gain control over the remaining fortified positions of the Ukrainians in that direction, which will secure the northern flank for offensive operations towards the coal mine area and Udashne to the west. The Russians continued offensive operations to the east as well, where they've secured the fortified position east of Kotlyne, securing the eastern flank of the town, allowing them for further offensive operations in the northern direction as they fight over the second line of defense here west of Pokrovsk. The Russians also managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Lysivka, where they are fighting now over the fortified positions north of Dashenske and Selene, where the objective is to gain control over these fortified positions and move onwards along the railway areas towards towns and villages here to the south of Pokrovsk, gaining control over the railway area here north of Shevchenko all the way to the north of Dashenske. The Russians will be able to secure the southern flank of Pokrovsk, creating a buffer zone between the logistical hubs such as Shevchenko from the Ukrainian positions, and also allowing for the forces to start launching attacks into Pokrovsk itself from the south. However, it is unlikely that the Russians will launch any significant attack towards Pokrovsk before they've secured the western and eastern flanks by cutting off the major supply lines in those directions and getting operational encirclement of the city. However, not attacking the city at all is also not possible, because the Ukrainians would at that point be able to redirect their forces to both flanks and secure the fighting there. That means that the Russians need to increase pressure on the city itself if they are to direct some of the Ukrainian forces to the defense of the city, and thereby spreading out the Ukrainian forces a bit more, allowing them to have successful offensive operations on the flanks of the city. The Russians also advanced east of Pokrovsk in the direction of Novopoltavka, where fighting is taking place within the town itself. We see this geolocated footage of Russian armored vehicles fighting within the town, geolocated here in the central parts of the town, as the Russians continue offensive operations along the highway towards Kotlyarivka here in the northeast. The Russians also managed to advance to the north of Toretsk, where fighting is taking place along the railway. The Russians gained full control over Dashne and cut off the railway connection to the northeastern parts of Kursk. The Ukrainians have a very vulnerable supply line that isn't even under their control anymore to supply their forces here in the Dashne direction. This means that the Ukrainians are physically encircled as the Russians have cut off the road here, and this geolocated footage shows Russian forces here to the south of Lysivka, where they are targeted by FPV drones by the Ukrainians. This means both roads are cut off, and the Ukrainians do not have any supply lines to supply their forces in the northeast of Kursk, which means the forces here are completely encircled, and the Ukrainians are fighting over Lysivka, gaining control over which will allow the Russians to gain control over the entire area here north of Kursk, redirect their forces to connect the positions in the industrial area with the ones in the forest area here to the south of Lysivka, cutting off and encircling the Ukrainian forces there as well. This means that the Russians will likely gain control over the general area here north of Toretsk over the coming days and weeks. We're seeing that the Russians continue their offensive operations mainly centered around the Donetsk region, where there's been very limited attacks by the Russian forces anywhere else on the front line. And with the Ukrainian reactivity in the Kursk region, we can see that the Ukrainians are attempting to divert the Russian attention away from only the Donetsk region by attacking other sectors of the front line and taking their attention elsewhere. The Russians are instead focusing entirely on the Donetsk region. They have redirected some of their artillery and air power to focus on the Donetsk region. The Russian air force is large, but not large enough to cover the entire front line. Instead, what they've been doing since the start of the war is when they are launching offensive operations in a specific sector of the front line, they redirect some of their air force to concentrate in one specific area to gain more air superiority in that area. When the Russians launched the Sucha offensive, regaining full control over the Kursk region, a lot of the air force was centered around that direction. Now it is in the Donetsk region. We can also assume that if the Russians are planning a larger offensive soon, then they would be limiting their offensive operations in much of the front line to save up some of their artillery and other weaponry to have a larger supply once the offensive starts, because the larger an offensive is, the more supplies is being used, so they need to build up their logistical hubs and their supply lines ahead of such an operation to build up their stockpiles to have enough weapons for such a larger operation to take place and be successful. For the first 4 days of May, the Russians have been capturing about 20 square kilometers a day as they are keeping up the rate of advances that is necessary for the analysis I previously made to become true. That means so far the Russians are in line to capture a larger portion of the Donetsk region within the next 2 months. We'll have to see what developments take place on other sectors of the front line while this offensive is taking place within the Donetsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.